Hello, my awesome accounting students. Glad you're here to discuss Chapter 20.
Hey, glad you guys made it today. Today's topic is going to be master budgeting. I was mentioning to another student a few minutes ago that budgeting is not one of my favorite topics, but it's also one that is required. He mentioned that he enjoys the process, and I think there's a good point behind that. And my statement was, if you don't manage your money will manage you. And I've learned that the hard way, I think, over the past years. So budgeting is a critical task. And it is not only important for a business, but it's also important in our own personal lives. Because again, if we don't manage where our money goes, we will wind up spending a lot longer to hit our financial goals than if we would have planned out a certain route to take. Here's our agenda. It is jam-packed because the budgeting chapter is jam-packed. As I mentioned to you last week, I think chapter 19 gave you a little bit of a break as far as difficulty goes. I don't think chapter 20 is necessarily difficult, but kind of like the overhead chapter, it can get tedious because there's going to be lots of numbers involved. So I would say that budgeting is one of the most important aspects of, again, not only managerial accounting, but our own personal lives as well. And in managerial accounting, it's part of the planning, directing, and controlling phase, which is pretty much what all of the management process is about. We have to plan our operations, then we need to direct our operations to carry out the plans that we've made, and then control. You have to go back and you have to measure performance to see if you hit your targets. And if you didn't hit your targets, you want to discover why didn't we, so that we can make any necessary adjustments during the period. So I would also say this: a budget is only as good as the control feature that comes after it. In other words, if I go through and I budget that I'm going to spend so much on personally, groceries each week, and I get to the end of the month and I found out that, oh my gosh, I've blown my budget, I have to do something to fix, to look behind why did this happen, and then number two, to fix any kind of deficiencies that have happened. And so up here, it is a key to successful financial performance. Many of you will be in positions where you're responsible for at least a portion of the budget. And part of your evaluation may very well be, did you hit the targets that you set out to hit at the start? So this chapter is going to help us create budgets. In another chapter, we'll talk about the variances. Did we hit our budgets? And if not, why not? And then in another chapter, we'll figure out, who do we go to when we miss a target? Who's responsible for that part of the entity? And then there are some minor topics in here. The reason I put minor, I want you to read about them. Our time together is going to be spent more on the accounting, but there's also behavioral theory that comes into play when we create our budgets. And so let me give you just one quick example while we're on the agenda. I could make the expectations, for example, in this class, super, super high, right? I could say that to get an A, you need to get 99% of the points. And if you make some behavioral considerations too extreme, people will just give up and they won't work to meet that objective. In other words, there's probably very few people in here that would strive to get that 99% threshold because it's kind of unrealistic. However, the flip side's also true. If I said that you're going to need 70% in this class to get an A, many people would do just enough, just bare minimum, 70%, knowing that they had that A locked up, and they wouldn't push themselves to meet the higher expectations that would come if the budget expectations were set in a more restrictive manner. So there's that balance. You can't be too tight and you can't be too lax. And that's where these behavioral considerations come in. So I want you to read about it. And then I also want you to read about the various type of budgeting methods. I want you to know that they are out there. We're not necessarily going to practice all of these, but I want you to be informed when you go into a business environment. So be certain that you're familiar with fiscal year budgeting, continuous budgeting, which is always they're looking out and continuously budgeting all year long. And then something that I've had some not so pleasant experience in, zero-based budgeting. That's where you don't care what other months look like, what other fiscal years look like. You're starting out at zero and you have to justify every cost that's in that budget. That happens many times in publicly held companies during RIF, reduction in force times. I know Boeing did it several years ago when they were beginning to lay off a vast majority of their staff. They didn't care what had happened in the 10 past fiscal years. They said, we are doing cost-cutting measures to turn this company around. And so all the managers needed to submit budgets as if they started with zero. So read about that. Our focus today is going to be on the master budget. And the master budget starts with the sales budget. And I know that's a test question. It's going to be what's the starting point for the master budget. It starts with the sales budget and it logically works its way down through the various levels. And those levels you'll see here listed on the agenda, but it's going to make more sense to you when we jump in and try them. So the sales budget is the starting point. That is how many items are you going to sell and how much revenue are you going to generate. Since this feeds all the other budgets, it's really important to spend adequate time on the sales budget. And what I don't think this chapter does too good of a job in is telling you how complicated the sales budget can be. It's not just someone gives you a figure. There's demand, market research, there's supply and demand. Right now, we know have some supply chain issues. It's your competition. What's your competitor selling? That might be more competing with what you're selling. It takes in a whole lot more factors than what the author shows you in this chapter. So just be aware of that. And then the production budget is going to tell us, based on the sales that you're projecting, how many units should you produce? And if there was no inventory considerations, the sales number will be the production number. But most companies aren't happy with just producing the minimum amount they need to meet their sales. Oftentimes, they like to have safety stocks built in. And so we'll learn how to tweak the sales budget to get to the units to be produced. By the way, I noted in capital letters down there, the production budget is the only budget that does not have any dollars associated with it. It's solely how many units should you produce. And then if you think kind of about this drop down level, almost like a pyramid, you start with your sales, then you do your production budget. And now we know this, there are 3 product costs. So based on that production budget, your next level is going to be direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. You'll see it graphed out for you in a moment. And then in addition to those product costs, you also have the period costs. So you're going to have a budget for selling expenses and general and administrative expenses as well. And then at the bottom, after you've compiled all this pyramid of budgets, the final budget that we're going to focus on in class is going to be the cash budget. That'll be all of next class period. And that cash budget is going to ask yourself, do you have enough cash in order to make those plans on the previous budgets happen? And if you don't have enough cash, then you need to know far enough ahead of time so that you can go get a line of credit or that you can work on some financing strategies to make sure that that master budget happens in the way that you imagine it. I think I'm going to show you part of a PowerPoint presentation. And then I think the most important part of this is going to be to jump in and get our hands dirty. So let me stop right there at the agenda. It is jam-packed. This is a very loaded chapter. So any questions on any of that? All right, so let me bring up the PowerPoint. You guys have access to the PowerPoints in the modules link. I'm not going through all the slides. I've picked some out. And here's how I present the budgeting chapter, because I think students can easily relate to this. I have a niece that goes to school in New York, right? So she's a West Coast girl, but she is going to school in New York. So here's my analogy for a budget. Her name's Cassie, by the way. And if I would say, Cassie, how are you going to get yourself to New York? Some people may just jump in the car, head east, and just go for it, right? Other people that are more concerned about how long it's going to take you to get there and how much you're going to spend would take the time to plan that trip out, look at a map, see how many stops they want to make along the way, and probably sit there and say, even to the detail, okay, what hotel am I going to stay at on this day? What hotel am I going to stay at on this day? Are there eating places along here? So here's my point. Whichever you pick, whether you just get in your car and you head east to go to New York, whether or not you choose a roadmap or not, you're gonna eventually get there. If you just keep heading east, eventually at some point you'll get to New York. But if you take the measured approach of finding out what's the quickest way to get from Los Angeles to New York, and you map it out and you know which highways are the quickest, you do it in a measured manner, you're going to get there a lot quicker than someone that just hops in their car and just kind of floats from here to there, hoping eventually they'll get to where they're going. So that's what a budget is. A budget is a set of plans, almost a financial blueprint that shows you here's the goal and here's the steps that I'm going to make to get from point A to point B. In financial planning, our hope is, and for you, my hope for you is that you at least take the time to write out some financial goals for yourself. Because if you don't write them out, you kind of just drift back and forth and you might eventually get there, but it's going to take you a lot more time. And so some of the benefits of budgeting is there are benchmarks created for evaluating performance. You can focus on future opportunities. It does take great coordination, setting up that roadmap. You got to gather a lot of other information, even in our simple rudimentary example of just driving from LA to New York. It takes some research. You want to take a look at what's out there and you want to chart the quickest path to get from point A to point B. The plan should be communicated and coordinated. And if at all possible, you want to bring the employees in and help them feel empowered to meet the objectives that you've set for the company. So I mentioned earlier that I wanted you to read about human behavior. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going over this. I already mentioned some of the things that can happen if you set too restrictive of a budget. Right? People are just going to say, I can't meet 99%, so I'm not even going to try. And they kind of throw their hands up. So we want to make sure that goals are attainable. And we want to make sure that the performance is built into the evaluation. There can be potential negative outcomes of budgets as well. And you guys can read about that. I'm most interested in jumping in and showing you how the accounting works. And then I also mentioned to you earlier in the agenda that I wanted you to be familiar with the various types of budgeting. And so here's an example of a continuous budget. They're constantly just budgeting one more month out, one more month out. Some companies are large enough, Boeing's an example, where they have a portion of their company that does nothing but do budgets all year. That's what they work on. That's their full-time job. So what I want to focus on today is this master budget. And I would tag this slide. In fact, Eddie, I don't know if you can take a screenshot of that, but I would love it if you can put that in your notes someplace. This is the master budget that we're following. However, we will not be doing budgeted financial statements in here. We're going to focus our efforts on all the budgets that lead up to the projected income statement, projected balance sheet, and so forth. So the starting point is this sales budget. So the sales budget takes a lot to create, and the author really waters this section down. Again, you guys are in a survey type of a class where you're surveying all the different major topics of accounting. Those of you that choose to go into a deeper dive will take more advanced classes where you'll go through some of the mechanics and some of the external factors like supply, demand, supply chains, that type of thing. So again, first step, I'm going to circle that because I remember that being a test question. The first step in this master budgeting process is to get a good sales budget. And that sales budget is going to tell you two things. It's going to tell you how many, right? So I'm going to put a number sign over here, how many units you intend to sell. And then it's also going to predict out the revenue, those dollars. I put dollar signs. The revenue is important because later on in the cash budget, you're going to have to predict out cash collections to figure out whether you're going to have enough money to finance the operations. So it's a drop down budget. That sales budget is at the very top. So we're going to do some of these today, but we'll jump in and take a look at an example. Here's someone that has decided they want to see quarterly budgets. The reason I know that is it's for 3 months, October, November, and December. So it looks like this is for hockey sticks. So they have done a projection of how many hockey sticks they want to sell. And then they've put in the selling price, and it's a simple calculation. So the sales budget, the author will portray it to be probably the easiest. In actuality, since it's your starting point, it's one of the most important budgets that we have. And there's a lot of external factors that affect that. Questions on the top portion on the sales budget. All right, the next layer down then is the production budget. And this is the one, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. This is the one that I mentioned in the agenda is the only budget that's not going to have any dollars on it. It answers this simple question: how many units of product do you want to produce? How many units of product do you want to produce? And so you will see me shorten up quite a bit the author's steps in Connect. I think they use way too many lines in Connect. So you're going to have to live with the built-in feature that we have in Connect. But as far as remembering for exam purposes, how do I do a production budget? My production budget's probably going to be 3 lines. In Connect, you're probably going to see 8 to 10 lines. So I'm going to show you how to go through the mental mechanics of it in the easiest way possible that I know how. And then if you have to use Connect, you'll have to go through their, pre-filled in boxes. We don't have that benefit in the real world. We don't have somebody giving us boxes and say, here, fill them in. We have to understand from a cognitive standpoint, okay, what am I after? So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the number of units to be sold and we're going to tweak it for inventory. So you'll see me do this, but in a nutshell, this is going to be the sales budget. That's our starting point. Tweaked for inventory. And when I say tweaked for inventory, you're going to add in any desired ending inventory because you want to make those extra items. Usually companies like to have some type of a safety stock, and you'll subtract out any beginning inventory. That would be inventory that's already in your cupboard, so to speak. If I have the stuff already in my cupboard, I don't have to go create it or produce it to get it. So in a nutshell, that sales budget is going to be the production budget is going to be 3 lines. Whatever you want to sell, okay, and that will be provided from the drop-down sales budget, tweaked for inventory. We're going to add in ending inventory because we want to make that to stock, and we'll take out any beginning inventory that's already hanging around in our closet, so to speak. I'm going to demonstrate it to you, so it's all going to drop down, make sense. But right now we're just talking kind of like the overview of what's going to happen. So let me stop. Any questions on the sales or the production budget?
Quick question. You wrote down sales budget. Which of the 4 squares does that encompass? Is that all 4 or is it? only the units to produce? Which one is it?
Yeah, the sales would be this one, I think. Again, I think he does it in a very awkward order in Connect, but it would be the budgeted number of sales plus the ending inventory that you want to make to stock, less the stuff that's already there. So I think we're saying the same thing. I think he shows it in a very confusing order myself. So.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.
All right, so let's think about this drop down. In fact, let me see if I can get a Word document up here just so I can scribble and open it just so I can scribble. So here's this process. We're going to do a sales budget first. Okay, that's going to show us two things, how many and the dollar sales. And the next one down is going to be the production budget. That's going to tell us one thing. How many do you want to produce? There's no dollars on that one. Okay, so if you think about this production budget, now this goes to the cost. We know there's 3 production costs. There's direct material, there's direct labor, and there's factory overhead. And in addition to those product costs, we have period costs. Let me write in period there. Let me write in product over here. Those 2 period costs are the selling expenses and then the G&A expenses. Okay, when all those are considered, then we're ready to figure out the cash budget. Are we going to have enough cash to fund all of those operations? So it's this drop down feature that we're doing in the master budgeting. One budget feeds the other. So you can see up here with all those other budgets below it, if you mess up the sales budget, the rest of these budgets are going to be off. Okay, now we'll learn in another chapter how to flex the budget forward for performance purposes. But for right now, we're talking about creating a master budget for a manufacturing entity. And so I think it's important to keep that drop down effect in mind. Okay, so back to this. We have our production budget. The most complicated of the budgets that we're going to be talking about today is the direct materials budget. I'm going to liken this to a shopping list. Okay, when I go to the grocery store, I need 2 things. I need to know how much I'm going to buy, right? The quantity, in other words, how much to buy, how many pounds of flour to make these pizzas, or how many pounds of chocolate chips to make these cookies. Of course, my mind would go there. All right, so how much to buy? And then the second part will be, what's it going to cost me? So the direct materials budget that we're looking at is super oversimplified because we're assuming, your author is assuming that we need 1 ingredient to make whatever it is we're going to manufacture. So again, this is a survey course. It's giving you an overall plan of attack on how to do this budget, but it's very oversimplified. Again, think about the drop down. What comes before the direct materials budget on this picture? The direct materials budget starts with the production budget. That's going to be the starting point. And so the direct materials budget is going to be how many units you want to produce. And then there's going to be 2 components of it going back to the PowerPoint here. It's going to ask you this. There's inventory issues on the materials as well. So if I'm going to make a pizza, I would need to do this for the dough. I would need to do this for the pepperoni. I would need to do this for the cheese. And they all summarize down into one direct materials budget. Again, working through it's going to be a whole lot, I think, better experience than just walking through some PowerPoint. So I'm eager to get there. Going back to this drop-down budget then, once we've done the materials, we can do any of these on the same level budgets. We could go right across. Labor tends to be the easiest because there's no inventory, right? You can't inventory people. So the next one, the direct labor budget, going back to this PowerPoint, is going to be 2 things. How many man hours or people hours do you need to, again, fulfill that production budget? And then what's the cost of that labor to you? Okay, and again, if you go look, these are on the same level. So here's our 3 product costs. We looked at materials, we looked at labor. The factory overhead budget usually is going to have 2 components on it. It's going to be variable overhead and fixed overhead. And again, it'll have to give you a driver. You've heard that term before in the overhead chapter. It'll have to give you a driver on what's going to drive this budget. Most of the time for us, it'll be based on direct labor hours. That's what will push the overhead budget. We'll see an example shortly. And then once you know the direct materials, the direct labor, and the factory overhead, you could figure out how much does 1 unit of product cost. So I think that's probably enough on the PowerPoints for today. There, of course, you guys know there's always a handout. I think on that handout, I've tried to just lay it out for you. I also have a lot more terms. We have short-term budgets, right? What are we going to be doing in this next year? And then we have longer-term strategic budgets. Okay, the longer-term strategic budgets are the plans that a company has 5 to 10 years out in the future. For most of us, we don't know what we're doing tomorrow, let alone 5 to 10 years out in the future. So those can get complicated. Those usually happen at the upper level of management, right? I don't know if you guys have listened to Bill Gates yet. Anytime recently. That guy is a visionary. So is Elon Musk. And if you ever want to sit in on some of their podcasts, the plans that they have for the future go above what most of us can comprehend. In this class, we're looking pretty much at the shorter term plans. So I think we're ready to just jump in and go for it. Any questions so far on any of those PowerPoints?
Okay, let's jump in and get our hands dirty. We notice up at the top that we're doing a production budget. That is the one budget that has no dollars on it. It's simply the answer to the question, how many units do we want to produce? In the lecture, we said if there were no inventory issues, it would simply be the number of units that we wish to sell. But we also said that companies usually like to create a safety stock or a certain amount of inventory that they want to have on hand. And we also said that we need to adjust it for any goods that we already have in our closet, so to speak. So when we read through this, it says the company provides the following budgeted sales for the next 4 months. So right before I turn the camera on, I put out April, May, June. And because most safety stocks are based on future months, I also added July in here. Not sure if I'm going to need it or not, but I went ahead and put it anyways. And then there's a statement. They want to finish with inventory equal to 25% of the next month's sales. So I'm going to add in the desired ending inventory. And I'm going to make a note to myself. That's estimated to be 25% of next month's sales. And then I'll take out any existing beginning inventory that's already on hand, because if it's on hand, there's no need to produce it. And so my final answer will be the units to be produced. So this is forward looking. If I want to have a safety stock of 25% of the next month's sales, I'm going to take, for April, the next month would be May, and multiply it by 25%. And when I get to May, I want to take a look at June's sales and multiply by 25%. And now you can see why I thought it prudent to include July. Because when I'm in the month of June, I want to look out to the next month, which is July, and take 25% of that. Okay, next, I want to take out any inventory that's already on hand. They made a statement here that April 1st inventory is 125 units. So I'm going to put a minus sign in front of the 125. And you might be wondering, well, how do I know what May's beginning inventory is? Okay, remember, just like your cash account, the inventory on the last day of April is your starting inventory on the first day of May. So I'm going to go pick up that estimated ending inventory for April and pop it in. And if I'm looking at June, the ending inventory for May will be the starting inventory for June. So I carried that out. And next is simply a footing or totaling option. I'm going to sum from the top to the bottom. Once you do that, you can carry that formula across. And here I have the first attempt at a piece of the master budget. This would be further up near the top of the budget. That is our production budget. All the other budgets that fall after this relies on the number of units to be produced. The direct materials budget supports the amount needed to purchase the materials for production. Not only will we need to budget for enough direct materials to meet the production budget, we also need to include, once again, any raw material safety stocks that the company wishes to keep. So if you think about the drop-down effect on the master budget, our starting point for the direct materials budget is the number of units to be produced. Once we have that, we'll multiply by the direct material requirements per unit, and we'll add that together to come up with the materials needed for production. This is where we need to address the inventory requirements for each of the raw materials that we'll be using during the production process. Again, this is a simplified survey course, so we're looking at this from a 20,000-foot view. I don't think many of us could think of many things, even that we cook, that only has one ingredient. So when we are producing these various units in the factory, many times there may be 10, 20, 30 different components, each requiring a materials budget. So this can be pretty substantial. So to tweak this for inventory, we would add the desired ending inventory of materials, and we would take out anything that's already on hand. So we'll call that less the beginning inventory. That will give us the materials needed to purchase, almost like a shopping list of what's needed to make the goods in the factory. To turn that into dollars, we'll multiply by the price per unit. I want you to think about the budget logically, step by step. It makes sense. And I would encourage you to think about possibly even something you're familiar with, like maybe making cookies. And how would you go about deciding how many pounds of flour you needed to purchase and how many bags of chocolate chips you needed to purchase? You don't just want to go to the store and buy exactly what you need to make that batch of cookies. You may want to have some extra ingredients in the kitchen. And if that direct material is already in your refrigerator or already in your cupboard, you don't need to go out and buy it. That's why the beginning inventory is backed out. So let's read this question together. We've set up the format for it. I'll let you try it before we go over the answer. Let's read. It says the company is preparing their direct materials budget for the second quarter. So one of the first things I do when I'm creating a budget is look for the time period that they're after. They're after the second quarter. They give you the budgeted production. That's going to be your starting point, that 240,000 units. Pick a column. You can always adjust. That's the second quarter, and they want 50,500 units in the third quarter. I'm not sure if I'm going to need that, but I'll go ahead and pencil that in. Of course, when we're preparing accounting spreadsheets, we always want to make sure that everything is labeled. So real quick, let me put second quarter and third quarter. Let's keep reading. Each unit requires 0.60 pounds for each unit. Let me put that requirement in. We'll go ahead and multiply that out. So if there were no material requirements for ending or beginning inventory, we'd be done. But they mentioned that they want to plan each quarter with an ending inventory equal to 30% of the next quarter's budgeted materials. So we need to tweak this for inventory. They just told us that not only do they want to purchase that 144,000 pounds of materials, but they also want next quarter to have a balance equal to 30% of next quarter's budget. In fact, next quarter's direct materials required is their wording. Okay, so I'm going to look forward to the next quarter. I know that in the third quarter, they plan on making 52,500 units. Each unit takes 0.60 pounds of material, and they want that safety stock equal to 30%. So that's what I'm going to use to calculate ending inventory. I look ahead at the third quarter's production needs. I know that each unit takes 0.60 or just over a pound of materials, and I'm multiplying it by 30%. When I do that, I come up with 9,450 pounds, and then we don't have to go shopping for anything that's already in our possession. So they mentioned up here that there's already 43,200 pounds of materials in our possession. So let me foot this. I have the pounds required for production tweaked for inventory. And when I pop it into my calculator, I get the units that I'm estimating I will need. I'll finish this off by multiplying it by the cost per pound of direct materials. They told us earlier that that was $175 a pound. So to finish this off, I would multiply the pounds by the cost or price per pound. And once the computer calculates that for me, this would be our direct materials purchases budget. Again, oversimplified. This product only takes one ingredient. It made our lives a whole lot easier. And again, most of us couldn't even think of something that we would cook that only takes one ingredient. So you can imagine the confusion challenge that would come in with doing a production budget that takes 20 or 30 different raw materials. The direct materials budget is more involved than others, so I would spend some time practicing that. And let's move on to our next one. This next exercise will be solved exactly the same way. It's going to give you additional practice on a direct materials budget. Instead of grouping one quarter together as they did in the last exercise, this one gives you 3 specific months that are involved in that quarter. So I'm going to pause the video. I would encourage you to see if you could write down the steps prior to starting the project. So what I did is just copied the exact same model that we used previously. The starting point's the production budget. We're going to multiply that by the pounds per unit. We'll come up with the pounds needed for production, and then we'll tweak it for inventory. We'll add in the desired ending inventory. I may have to change that percentage. I just copied that over. Take out the beginning inventory to give us the pounds to be purchased. To turn that into dollars, we'll multiply by the rate per pound to come up with our total direct materials purchases budget. try that on your own and we'll check our answers against one another. Here's the solution. I would suggest you go down to the bottom line and compare your answers. We calculated the direct materials purchases budget for each of the 3 months. We did rely on data in the future month, so you'll see that off to the side just to help you with the calculation. If you followed the logic and were able to calculate those total lines, then you're prepared to do a direct materials budget. On the other hand, if you struggled or you found yourself having to look back at your notes, you need a little bit more practice on the direct materials budget. Let's move on to the next one. This exercise includes a direct materials budget, a direct labor budget, and the overhead budget. So once again, think about the pyramid effect of how budgeting works. Kind of to backtrack, we started off with the sales budget. Our next step was a production budget. The production budget simply showed us how many units we wanted to produce. That production budget feeds the next series of product cost budgets, which is what this question is asking us about. We've had a little bit of practice with direct materials. I went ahead in the interest of time and put the same exact set of formulas that we've used on the previous 2 exercises. So we'll read for content and then I'll pause while you do the direct materials purchases budget. However, because we haven't yet demonstrated the labor or overhead budget, I'll do that one with you after you check your direct materials budget. So let's go ahead and read. I would encourage you, if you have this printed out, to circle the relevant data. Sometimes part of the challenge in this budgeting chapter is just keeping all the information in an organized fashion so we know where to get it when we need it. So this time they're making leather purses, and each purse requires 2 pounds of direct materials at a cost of $4 per pound. So in that sentence, they give us the material requirement that we'll be using, and they gave us the cost per pound. Okay, then they tell us about some labor statistics and some variable and fixed overhead. We can ignore that for right now. The company's policy is to end each month with direct materials equal to 40% of the next month's direct materials budget. They gave us the beginning inventory here, and the first step for you is to compute the direct materials purchases budget. I'll give you a few minutes, pause the video, and let's check our answers on the direct materials budget before we try the labor and overhead budget together. On the screen, you'll see the solution for the direct materials purchases budget. Check out that yellow bottom line, and if you came up with the same answer, then we're ready to move on. And if you came up with something different, get a highlighter pen and circle your mistake so you'll be more careful on that on the next budget. Let's move on and do the direct labor and factory overhead budget together. Let's zero in on the labor requirements. As we mentioned, the starting point is the production budget. So this yellow line that we started our purchases budget with, our direct materials purchases budget, also is the starting point for the direct labor budget. Now we're after how long does a purse take to make, and what is the rate per hour they pay their employees. Okay, well, if we keep reading this problem, it says that it takes 8/10 of a direct labor hour to create the purse, and the rate of pay is $16 per hour. So the labor budget is generally easier because there is no inventory involved. So this purse takes 0.8 direct labor hours for each purse that they make. So I will put that rate in. I'll multiply the number of units to be produced to get the direct labor hours. Let me put a total line in there. Let me do the math. In Excel, if you do the first formula, you can just copy it over and automatically have the other formulas created. We have the number of hours. To turn it into dollars, we need to multiply by the direct labor pay rate, and that was given to us at $16 per hour. Let me copy that across. And once again, this is a fairly easy budget. This is the budgeted direct labor cost in dollars after I allow the computer to do its math, or your calculator, either one. Let me pull that over, take a look at that final answer. And again, all of this will flow down to create future budgets as well. It is a step down approach. Keep that in mind as we work through the exercises. The last one that they ask us to prepare is a factory overhead budget. Okay, this is also based on the production budget as we look at that drop-down approach. So in the interest of time, I'm going to copy that title. I'll change this from a direct labor budget to a factory overhead budget. And based on the information they gave us, it looks like there's going to be a variable component and a fixed component. So we need to see how they are charging out their overhead. It says that variable overhead is budgeted at a rate of $2 per direct labor hour. And that budgeted fixed overhead is $10,000 a month. Okay, well, $2 per direct labor hour, I think we can even take a shortcut, and instead of the units to be produced, we already have direct labor hours. So let me get rid of this item. And since it's based on direct labor hours, let's copy down this item. And we'll have half of our budget solved. Now it didn't copy properly, so I'm going to go use a cell reference and grab it to fix that. And occasionally this mouse has a mind of its own. There we go. We'll multiply that by the variable overhead rate. I believe they told us that was, let's see, $2 per hour. And so I'll turn that into dollars by multiplying the two. Let me carry that 2 across. And that would give us the variable overhead. Let the computer do its math. Okay, so the variable overhead is charged out, it looks like, based on direct labor hours. So there's the variable overhead. The fixed overhead, they told us, was a flat $10,000 per month. Remember that over the relevant range, the fixed overhead or any other fixed costs do not change. So this was a fairly easy budget. The total factory overhead budget would be the sum of the variable and the fixed. And take a look at the line, which I'll make yellow. And once again, depending on how that went, you may be ready to move on. You may need a little bit more practice. The last problem that we'll look at today will be a review of everything that we talked about today. So we'll read it together, and then I'll pause the videos and give you a shot at it. Here's our problem to wrap up the day. In this problem, you'll be asked to prepare a production budget, a materials budget, a labor budget, and an overhead budget. I would encourage you to write the facts down as you come across them and go ahead and try this one on your own. When preparing these drop-down budgets, one budget leads to the next, so make sure you prepare them in the order prescribed and understand that the materials budget is the one that you're most likely to make a mistake on. So give it a shot and I'll show you the answer shortly. Let's see how you did. First off, we should have done our production budget, which is basically the sales budget adjusted for inventory requirements. That is the only budget that has no dollars on it. When we completed that, we should have come up with 248,000 units that are needed to produce. That's going to be the starting point for the next level of budgets, which will include the 3 product costs. The direct materials budget often causes the most problem. On that budget, we started with a number of units to be produced. We multiplied by the direct materials requirement per unit. We came up with the pounds needed for production, and then we needed to tweak that for inventory. Finally, to turn those pounds into dollars, we multiplied by the cost per pound. Next budget down is the direct labor budget, usually one of the easiest because there are no inventory related issues. So once again, we started with the production budget. We found that each unit took half an hour to complete. We came up with 124,000 labor hours, multiplied by the rate provided by the author, and came up with the direct labor materials budget as you see on the screen. And then lastly, we took it down once again to the next product cost level, which is the factory overhead budget. There were 2 components on this problem, a variable component and a fixed component. We got the labor hours from the direct labor budget right above it. We multiplied by the variable overhead rate. We added to that the fixed overhead given by the author, and we came up with our factory overhead budget. This completes the first half of the chapter where we are learning how to do the various pieces of the master budget. Our next class will focus on the all-important cash budget, which answers the question, do we have the funds available to make these financial plans happen? This is Professor Johnson signing out.